The morning of November 3rd, 1943, somewhere over the North Sea at 24,000 feet, First Lieutenant Robert Hayes hunched over a dim green radar scope in the nose of a B-17 Flying Fortress. His Mickey set, as the crews called the H-2X radar, painted a fuzzy picture of the European coastline below. Somewhere in that electronic fog lay the port of Wilhelmshaven, hidden beneath 8/10 cloud cover that turned the world below into a featureless grey blanket. Hayes wasn't supposed to be doing what he was about to do. The technique he'd developed over the past month violated every procedure in the official radar operator's manual. But those official procedures were failing. Bomb after bomb falling into empty countryside or suburban neighborhoods, while German factories churned out fighters and U-boats unmolested. Hayes had watched strike photography from previous raids, bombs scattered across miles of terrain, occasionally hitting something useful by sheer accident. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The radar was supposed to change that. It was supposed to let American bombers strike with precision even when clouds hid the targets. It wasn't working. The problem wasn't the radar itself. The AN divided by APS-15, officially designated but universally called Mickey, could detect cities and coastlines well enough. The 3-centimetre wavelength gave sharper images than the British H-2S sets, clear enough to distinguish harbours from open water, urban centres from farmland, but identifying a specific factory complex within a city proved nearly impossible. The radar scope showed blobs of brightness where buildings reflected radio waves, darker patches where parks or rivers absorbed them, everything blurred together into ambiguous grey masses that shifted and changed as the bomber flew. Official doctrine said radar operators should study their target cities before missions, memorize the distinctive radar patterns. The Thames River winding through London had a characteristic snake shape on the scope. Hamburg's position on the Elbe estuary created a recognizable signature. Learn these patterns, the manual insisted, and you could identify your target through any overcast. Hayes had tried that approach. Every navigator in the 482nd Bombardment Group at Alconbury had tried it. The results were dismal. Radar images changed depending on altitude, heading, weather conditions, and a dozen other variables. A pattern that looked clear in training looked completely different during an actual mission when flak burst around the aircraft and fighters dove through the formation. The Thames looked like a dozen other rivers. Hamburg's estuary could be mistaken for any coastal inlet along hundreds of miles of German-held territory. But Hayes had noticed something the official procedures ignored. The radar didn't just show geography, it showed timing. By watching how quickly the ground images scrolled across his scope, he could calculate precise ground speed. By noting how the images drifted left or right as the bomber flew, he could measure wind drift. The Mickey set accidentally provided navigation data that no one was supposed to use for navigation. The official role of a Mickey operator was simple and narrow. Find the target on radar, guide the pilot to the initial point, make the bomb run, drop when the bombardier gave the signal, or if clouds covered everything, drop when the radar scope showed the target pattern. That was it. Navigation belonged to the navigator sitting at his table in the main fuselage. The radar operator's job was target identification only, except that system failed constantly. Navigators, using traditional methods, dead reckoning and celestial fixes, could get formations to the general target area, but general target area meant somewhere within 5 or 10 miles of the actual target. When you wanted to hit a factory complex covering a few acres, being 10 miles off course meant your bombs hit residential neighborhoods or empty fields. The Norden bomb site could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet, the advertising claimed, but only if the bombardier was looking at the right pickle barrel instead of one 10 miles away. Hayes realized that if he used the Mickey set to constantly update navigation, feeding corrections to the navigator and pilot throughout the flight, he could get the bomber to the exact release point, not the general area. The exact point. The technique required taking radar fixes every few minutes instead of relying on planned navigation checkpoints. It meant treating the Mickey scope as a navigation tool instead of just a target identifier. It meant the radar operator essentially taking over part of the navigator's job. Command hated that idea. The Army Air Forces had established clear crew positions and responsibilities. Navigators navigated, bombardiers bombed. Radar operators operated radar for target identification. Blurring those lines invited confusion and mistakes. What if the radar operator gave bad navigation corrections? What if the navigator and radar operator contradicted each other? Who would the pilot believe? The entire crew coordination system could collapse. So the official word came down from headquarters. Radar operators were forbidden from providing navigation updates. They could use radar to identify the target at the last moment before bomb release. Nothing more. Any navigator caught teaching unauthorized radar navigation techniques would face disciplinary action. Hayes had ignored those orders, not out of rebelliousness, but out of necessity. He'd developed his technique on missions where official procedures failed completely. He'd refined it between flights, making notes about which radar landmarks appeared most reliable, which features stayed consistent across different altitudes and weather. He'd quietly shared the method with other radar operators in the barracks at Alconbury, showing them how to use the sweep rate, birth of returns across the scope to calculate ground speed, how to measure drift angles by watching coastlines slide past. Now, over the North Sea with Wilhelmshaven somewhere ahead beneath solid cloud cover, Hayes prepared to use every bit of that forbidden knowledge. The mission today carried extra weight. This was the first major combat test of the H-2X radar system. The entire daylight precision bombing campaign over Europe hung in the balance. If radar-guided bombing worked, the 8th Air Force could continue operations regardless of weather. If it failed, bombers would sit grounded 4 days out of 5 through the European winter, giving German industry uninterrupted production time. The bomber formation began its turn toward the target. Hayes's pilot, Captain James Morrison, called back on the intercom. "How's it looking, Hayes? Can you see anything?" Hayes stared at his scope. The coastline of Germany appeared as a bright, jagged line about 40 miles ahead. Somewhere behind that coast lay Wilhelmshaven's naval facilities, submarine pens, and shipyards. The primary target for today. Critical infrastructure that needed destruction. But through the murk of distance and clouds, Hayes saw only the vague outline of land meeting water. "Coastlines clear, sir. Targets still too far for detail." Hayes toggled his transmitter. He wasn't supposed to do what came next, but Morrison had flown with him before. The pilot knew Hayes's techniques worked. "Recommend heading correction. 2 degrees left. Current ground speed indicates we're running fast." The navigator's voice crackled over the intercom. "I show us on course. Ground speed matches plan." Morrison made the decision instantly. Hayes's call. Left 2 degrees. The bomber eased into the turn. Behind them, 20 other B-17 seconds followed. Hayes watched his scope. The coastline crept closer. Details began emerging from the electronic noise. A harbour entrance. The distinctive shape of barrier islands. He'd studied Wilhelmshaven's radar signature for hours. He knew what he should be seeing, but the blob on his scope could be any harbour along hundreds of miles of coast. This was where traditional pathfinding failed. The operators who followed official doctrine would squint at their scopes, try to match what they saw to memorized patterns, and make educated guesses. Half the time, those guesses put bombs miles from intended targets. Hayes wasn't guessing. He was navigating. He called his next correction. Left 1 degree. Ground speeds dropped. We're hitting headwind. The aircraft turned again. The formation followed. Hayes measured the drift of radar returns across his scope. He calculated wind speed from how much the images moved sideways versus forward. He compared the bomber's heading to its actual ground track shown on radar. Every piece of data fed his mental picture of where the aircraft actually was, not where the flight plan said it should be. The miles disappeared beneath clouds. The radar image sharpened. Hayes saw the harbour mouth clearly now, the shipyards spreading along the waterfront, the geometric pattern of docks and slipways. This was Wilhelmshaven. Not maybe, not probably, definitely. His unauthorized navigation technique had delivered the formation to the exact target. "Target in sight," Hayes announced. Recommend IP in 30 seconds. Heading 095. Morrison acknowledged. Bombardier, prepare for IP. Hayes has the target. The submarine pens appeared on Hayes's scope as distinctive rectangular shadows. The radar waves couldn't penetrate the massive concrete shelters, so they showed as dark voids in the electronic clutter, perfect aiming points. Hayes began calling the bomb run. Steady on 095. Rate is good. Targets centered. The bombardier hunched over his northern sight, seeing nothing but clouds. Without Hayes's radar guidance, he'd be dropping blind, hoping they were over the right city, let alone the right facility. With radar, and he had precision. Bombs away, the bombardier called. Behind them, 20 other bombers released simultaneously. Tons of high explosive plunged through the Overcast toward the submarine pens below. Hayes watched his scope until the bomber completed its turn away from the target. The German flak batteries had fired blind through the clouds, dangerous but ineffective without visual tracking. The formation headed back toward England. Hayes secured his radar set and began filling out his mission report. He described the successful target identification. He noted the clear radar returns. He mentioned nothing about his navigation corrections. Official doctrine didn't approve those techniques. The mission report needed to show that orthodox procedures worked. 3 days later, photo reconnaissance flights over Wilhelmshaven showed something command hadn't seen in months of radar-guided bombing. Actual target damage. The bombs had landed on and around the submarine facilities. Not perfect precision, but concentrated enough to cause genuine destruction instead of scattered impacts across miles of coastline. Intelligence officers reviewed the mission reports. They saw that Hayes's aircraft had led the formation. They saw the accurate bombing. They made connections. Within a week, Hayes received orders to report to the 482nd Group Commander, Colonel Baskin Lawrence. Hayes walked into the commander's office, expecting discipline. He'd violated procedures. He'd taught unauthorized techniques. He'd essentially taken over navigation duties that weren't his responsibility. Instead, Lawrence looked up from Hayes's mission reports and said 6 words that changed everything. "Show me exactly what you did." The technology that brought Hayes to that meeting had been rushed into existence barely 12 months earlier. The British had pioneered ground-mapping radar with their H2S system in 1942. American scientists at MIT's radiation laboratory saw the H2S and immediately understood both its promise and its limitations. The 10-centimeter wavelength provided adequate range but poor resolution. Cities appeared as fuzzy blobs. Individual facilities within cities blurred together. The British used H2S for area bombing at night, guiding formations to general urban areas where precise target identification didn't matter. The Americans needed something better. The entire doctrine of the 8th Air Force rested on precision daylight bombing. Hit factories, not cities. Destroy industrial capacity, not civilian housing. The Norden bombsight and visual bombing made that possible in clear weather. But clear weather over Europe was rare. Clouds covered targets 4 days out of 5. Without a way to bomb through Overcast with precision, the daylight campaign would fail. MIT's scientists tackled the resolution problem by cutting the wavelength from 10 centimeters to 3 centimeters. That simple change tripled the radar's ability to distinguish small features. The new system, designated AN divided by APS-15, but immediately nicknamed Mickey after the radar dome's resemblance to Mickey Mouse, could theoretically show enough detail to identify specific factory complexes within cities. Theoretically. Actually making it work required solving problems the scientists couldn't address in laboratories. The Mickey set generated incredible amounts of heat in the confined space of a bomber's nose. The electronics failed constantly from vibration and cold. The rotating scanner dish had to be mounted in a radome that replaced the ball turret, creating drag that slowed the aircraft. The scope produced such a dim image that operators needed minutes of dark adaptation before they could see anything useful. But the biggest problem was interpretation. Looking at a radar scope and understanding what you were seeing required a completely new skill. The greenish glow on a cathode ray tube bore little resemblance to a map or aerial photograph. Operators needed training to distinguish rivers from roads. industrial areas from residential districts, single buildings from clusters. The British had been developing these skills for over a year. American radar operators had weeks. The 482nd Bombardment Group formed at RAF Alconbury in August 1943, specifically to develop and deploy radar pathfinding techniques. The group drew its initial crews from experienced navigators and bombardiers across the 8th Air Force, men who'd flown multiple missions, who understood the complexities of formation, flying, and target identification. Men who could hopefully figure out how to make the Mickey sets work operationally. Those first weeks at Alconbury were chaos. The radar sets broke down constantly. Training missions revealed how much the radar images differed from maps and photographs. Operators struggled to identify even obvious targets like coastlines and major rivers. The first attempt at a combat mission, planned for September, was scrubbed when half the Mickey sets failed pre-flight checks. Official training doctrine focused on pattern recognition. Study your target city. Memorize its distinctive radar signature. Practice until you can identify it instantly. The approach made sense in theory. Cities did have recognizable patterns: London's Thames, Hamburg's Elbe, Berlin's distinctive layout with the Spree running through it. Learn those patterns, and you could guide bombers to the right city even through complete overcast. But cities looked different on radar depending on countless variables. Altitude changed the viewing angle, and thus the pattern of returns. Weather affected how much signal the ground reflected back. Even the bomber's heading mattered. A city approached from the east looked different than the same city approached from the north. The radar signatures weren't fixed patterns. They were dynamic images that changed constantly. Worse, many German industrial targets sat in cities that had no distinctive radar signatures. Essen, Schweinfurt, Brunswick. Critical industrial centers that appeared on radar as generic urban blobs, indistinguishable from dozens of other German cities. Pattern recognition couldn't help when the patterns weren't unique. The navigators in the 482nd began comparing notes. Between missions, in the barracks, over drinks at the officers' club, they discussed what worked and what failed. Certain features proved more reliable than others. Coastlines stayed consistent. Large rivers showed clearly even through weather. Open water gave distinctive returns. Urban centers created characteristic bright blobs surrounded by darker rural areas. Someone, probably multiple someones independently, realized the radar could provide real-time navigation updates. The sweep rate of returns across the scope indicated ground speed. The drift angle of features showed wind effect. By taking frequent radar fixes on identifiable landmarks and correlating them with maps, operators could track their actual position continuously instead of relying on dead reckoning from the last celestial fix. This approach contradicted everything in the official manual. Radar operators were supposed to find targets, not navigate. The navigator's job was navigation. Blurring responsibilities invited disaster. But the operators who experimented with continuous radar navigation started achieving something remarkable. They were actually reaching their targets. Hayes hadn't invented the technique alone. Dozens of radar operators at Alconbury were developing similar methods simultaneously, but Hayes refined it into a systematic procedure. Take a radar fix every 5 minutes on any identifiable landmark. Calculate the offset between planned position and actual position. Provide heading corrections to close the gap. By the bomb run, the bomber would be exactly where it needed to be. The technique worked because it acknowledged a fundamental truth about high-altitude bombing over Europe. You couldn't navigate accurately enough using pre-flight planning and periodic updates. The wind at 20,000 feet changed constantly. Jet stream effects that meteorologists barely understood pushed formations dozens of miles off course. Dead reckoning navigation accumulated errors that grew with every mile flown. By the time a formation reached Germany, those errors put them anywhere within a 10-mile radius of their intended position. 10 miles was the difference between hitting a ball-bearing plant and leveling a residential district. 10 miles was the difference between destroying a Messerschmitt factory and bombing an empty field. 10 miles meant mission failure even when the bombs released perfectly from the bombardier's perspective. You couldn't bomb what you couldn't find. Continuous radar navigation closed that 10-mile gap. Not perfectly. The technique still depended on identifying landmarks correctly. It still suffered from radar limitations and interpretation errors, but it narrowed the miss distance from miles to hundreds of yards. That improvement transformed radar pathfinding from an experiment into a viable weapon. Command didn't want to hear it. The prohibition against radar operators conducting navigation came from concerns about crew coordination. The Army Air Forces had learned through years of experience that clear division of responsibilities kept crews functioning smoothly under stress. Everyone knew their job. Everyone stayed in their lane. Confusion about who was responsible for what could get everyone killed. The brass also worried about maintaining standards. If you let radar operators navigate, what was stopping them from making mistakes that official navigators wouldn't make? The radar operators weren't trained navigators. They didn't have the same background in celestial navigation, dead reckoning, and map reading. Letting them override trained navigators seemed like inviting disaster. But those concerns assumed the radar operators were trying to replace navigators. Hayes and the others weren't. They were trying to supplement navigation with real-time updates that only radar could provide. The navigator still did the bulk of navigation work, calculating the flight plan, taking celestial fixes, monitoring fuel consumption. The radar operator simply provided corrections during the final approach to target when precision mattered most. The unofficial radar navigation technique spread through the 482nd despite official prohibitions. It spread because it worked. Crews that used it hit their targets. Crews that didn't scattered their bombs randomly. Word got around. New radar operators arriving at Alconbury learned the technique from veterans in late-night training sessions that officially never happened. By early November 1943, maybe half the radar operators at Alconbury used continuous radar navigation regularly. They didn't mention it in mission reports. They described their techniques in ways that technically complied with official procedures. They found the target using radar. How they found the target remained conveniently vague. The Wilhelmshaven mission on November 3rd marked a turning point not because of Hayes's unauthorized technique, but because it demonstrated that H-2X radar could work operationally. The skeptics who'd argued that radar bombing was too inaccurate to justify the resources had to confront photographic evidence of actual target damage from a radar-guided mission. Colonel Lawrence wasn't naive. He'd commanded bomber groups long enough to know when his crews were bending regulations. The post-mission interviews with Hayes's crew revealed that something beyond official procedures had guided that mission. Lawrence needed to know what. Hayes spent 2 hours in Lawrence's office explaining his technique in detail. How he used radar sweep rates to calculate ground speed, how he measured drift angles, how he took fixes on coastal features and compared them to maps, how he provided continuous heading corrections instead of waiting for official checkpoints. Lawrence asked hard questions. What happened if the radar operator made a mistake? How did this affect the navigator's ability to do his job? What if different operators used different techniques and gave contradicting corrections? Hayes had answers for all of them, because he'd been thinking about these problems for months. If the radar operator made a mistake, the navigator's traditional methods would catch it because both were tracking position independently. The navigator could do his job better because he had real-time data to validate his calculations, instead of wondering if his dead reckoning had accumulated large errors. Different operators using different techniques wasn't a problem if the techniques all aimed at the same goal, getting accurate position updates from radar. Lawrence made his decision. This stays unofficial. I can't authorize you to violate written procedures, but I'm not going to stop techniques that improve bombing accuracy. Train every radar operator in this group, quietly. The unauthorized technique became the worst-kept secret at Alconbury. Veterans taught new arrivals. Radar operators compared methods and refined procedures. The technique evolved rapidly as dozens of minds worked on the same problem. Someone figured out that multiple radar fixes triangulated to give position updates, even when only one landmark was identifiable. Someone else discovered that measuring the range rate to a fixed landmark provided instant ground speed updates more accurate than any calculation. The results showed in strike photography. Missions led by 482nd Pathfinders achieved dramatically better accuracy than missions led by crews using orthodox radar procedures, not perfect accuracy. Radar bombing would never match visual bombing in clear conditions, but accurate enough to hit factory complexes instead of random neighborhoods. Accurate enough to justify continuing operations through the winter weather when European skies disappeared beneath clouds. Command noticed. How could they not? The statistics were undeniable, but acknowledging the accuracy improvements meant acknowledging that crews were violating official procedures. That created an impossible situation. The brass couldn't officially approve unauthorized techniques, but they couldn't order crews to stop using methods that significantly improved mission success. The solution was willful ignorance. Don't ask exactly how the 482nd Pathfinders achieved their results. Don't inquire too deeply into their radar operating procedures. Don't update the official manuals because that would require admitting the official manuals were wrong. Just let it continue and enjoy the improved bombing accuracy. This compromise worked through November and December 1943. The 482nd expanded from 3 squadrons to include additional crews trained in radar pathfinding. Each bomber group in the 8th Air Force received 1 or 2 Mickey-equipped aircraft that deployed to Alconbury for training before returning to lead their parent units. The training included official procedures from the manual. It also included unofficial techniques taught in evening sessions where no records were kept. By January 1944, the 8th Air Force was flying radar pathfinder-led missions whenever weather-obscured targets. The missions weren't perfectly accurate, but they were accurate enough. German factories took damage, transportation networks got disrupted, oil refineries burned. The strategic bombing campaign continued through the worst winter weather Europe had seen in years. The breaking point came in March 1944. The 8th Air Force launched a major raid against Berlin on March 4th, the first daylight attack on the German capital by American heavy bombers. The Pathfinder aircraft leading that mission was from the 482nd, carrying a crew that included multiple operators who'd learned Hayes's unauthorized navigation technique. The mission succeeded. Berlin took damage. The strategic and psychological impact was enormous, but the success raised questions that command couldn't ignore anymore. How exactly had Pathfinders guided formations of hundreds of bombers to targets in Berlin through complete cloud cover? The official procedures didn't explain it. Pattern recognition couldn't account for that level of accuracy over such a long distance from England to Berlin and back. Intelligence debriefings with the radar operators revealed what everyone already knew, but nobody had officially acknowledged. The Pathfinders were using real-time radar navigation, taking continuous fixes, and providing constant heading corrections throughout the mission. They weren't just finding targets. They were navigating to targets with precision that orthodox procedures couldn't match. General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, faced a decision. He could crack down on unauthorized procedures and force strict adherence to official doctrine. That would probably reduce bombing accuracy back to unacceptable levels. Or he could acknowledge reality and update official procedures to match what actually worked. Doolittle chose reality. In late March 1944, new guidance went out to all radar pathfinder units. Radar operators were authorized and encouraged to provide real-time navigation updates during missions. The prohibition against radar navigation was lifted. The techniques that Hayes and dozens of other operators had developed in violation of regulations became official doctrine. The policy change came with an important caveat. The Navigator remained responsible for overall mission navigation. The radar operator provided supplementary updates, not replacement navigation. Crew coordination remained critical. Both Navigator and radar operator needed to communicate constantly, cross-checking their position calculations against each other. The system worked best when both specialties reinforced each other. Training programs adapted quickly. New radar operators learned continuous navigation techniques from day one, instead of picking them up unofficially from veterans. Standardized procedures emerged. Everyone learned to take fixes the same way, calculate corrections using the same methods, communicate updates using the same terminology. The variation and confusion of unauthorized techniques gave way to consistent professional practice. Bombing accuracy improved measurably. Studies comparing early 1944 missions to late 1943 missions showed dramatic reductions in missed distances. The percentage of bombs landing within 1,000 feet of the aim point nearly tripled. German industrial production felt the impact. Facilities that had suffered only scattered damage from inaccurate raids now faced concentrated destructive attacks. The transformation from forbidden technique to official doctrine happened remarkably fast. Barely 4 months from the Wilhelmshaven mission to the Berlin raid to official policy change. That speed reflected desperate necessity. The 8th Air Force couldn't afford to let weather ground its bombers for months while official procedures caught up to operational reality. The strategic bombing campaign was too critical. Germany's war production needed to be destroyed before the planned invasion of France. Weather couldn't be allowed to protect German industry. But the speed also reflected something admirable about the organization. When confronted with clear evidence that existing procedures failed and unauthorized techniques worked, command changed the procedures. Bureaucratic inertia didn't win. Concerns about maintaining proper channels didn't override effectiveness. The system adapted, because the alternative was failure. Hayes became one of the instructors at the radar school established at Alconbury in April 1944. Every bomber group in the 8th Air Force was receiving its own Mickey-equipped aircraft. Every group needed radar operators trained in the latest techniques. Hayes spent the spring and summer of '44 teaching the methods he'd developed over winter's combat missions. The irony wasn't lost on him. 6 months earlier, he'd been teaching the same techniques in unofficial sessions that could have gotten him court-martialed. Now he stood in front of official classrooms teaching authorized procedures that were word-for-word identical to the forbidden methods. The only difference was approval from headquarters. The technique hadn't changed. The policy had. By summer 1944, the transformation was complete. What had been a forbidden workaround was now standard operating procedure throughout the 8th Air Force. But the adoption of continuous radar navigation created new problems that nobody had anticipated. Success bred its own complications. The first issue was equipment reliability. The Mickey sets had never been designed for the intensive use that continuous navigation required. Official doctrine assumed operators would turn on their radars shortly before reaching the target, identify the aim point, guide the bomb run, then shut down. Total operating time may be 15 to 20 minutes per mission. Continuous navigation meant running the radar for hours. From the moment bombers crossed the English coast outbound until they returned inbound. The electronic components, barely reliable for short-duration use, failed constantly under extended operation. Vacuum tubes burned out from heat. Magnetrons lost power after prolonged transmission. The rotating scanner mechanisms seized from vibration and cold. Ground crews at bomber bases across England found themselves working around the clock to keep Mickey sets operational. Pre-flight checks that used to take 30 minutes now required 2 hours. Spare parts became critically scarce because nobody had planned for this usage rate. Missions launched with half their Pathfinder aircraft showing radar malfunctions. Crews learned to nurse temperamental sets through entire missions, adjusting power levels, tapping components that stuck, manually rotating scanner dishes that wouldn't turn on their own. The second problem was training capacity. The radar school at Alconbury could only graduate so many operators. Each bomber group needed multiple Mickey crews to ensure at least one was available for every mission. With groups rotating back to the States for rest and refit, with casualties creating constant turnover, the demand for trained radar operators exceeded supply by substantial margins. The 8th Air Force tried to address this by establishing additional training programs at bases throughout England, but effective instructors were scarce. The best radar operators were the veterans who'd developed the techniques through combat experience. Those same veterans were needed to lead missions. You couldn't pull your best Pathfinder crews off operations to teach school. That would reduce current bombing effectiveness to improve future capabilities. An impossible trade-off during active combat. The compromise was hasty training. New operators learned the basics in abbreviated courses, then learned the nuances on actual combat missions. flying with experienced crews, watching how veterans interpreted radar returns, absorbing knowledge that couldn't be taught from manuals. It worked, barely. The learning curve was steep and dangerous. Some operators never developed the instinct for radar interpretation. They could follow procedures mechanically but couldn't adapt when conditions didn't match the textbook. Those operators occasionally provided disastrously wrong navigation updates, misidentifying landmarks, calculating incorrect ground speeds, leading formations miles off target. The worst incidents involved multiple Pathfinder aircraft following the same bad operator, reinforcing errors instead of correcting them. Bombs fell on neutral territory, on friendly positions, on undefended towns of no military value. Each mistake required investigation, reports explaining what went wrong, sometimes courts-martial if negligence was proved. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The third problem was German adaptation. The Luftwaffe wasn't stupid. They noticed that American bombing accuracy improved dramatically in late 1943 and early 44. German intelligence collected evidence from shot-down Pathfinder aircraft, examined captured radar sets, interrogated captured radar operators. By spring 1944, the Germans understood that American Pathfinders used continuous radar navigation to guide formations through Overcast. That knowledge allowed countermeasures. German fighters began targeting Pathfinder aircraft specifically. The distinctive radome under the nose made Mickey-equipped bombers easy to identify. Shoot down the Pathfinders, and the formation lost its ability to navigate accurately to target. Missions with heavy Pathfinder losses scattered bombs randomly, despite all the sophisticated radar equipment on surviving aircraft. German radar jamming also evolved. Early jamming efforts had focused on blinding defensive radars and navigation aids. Now the Germans developed jammers tuned to the 3-centimeter wavelength that Mickey used. The jammers were crude and limited in range, but they created enough interference that radar operators near heavily defended targets saw nothing but electronic snow on their scopes. The last few miles of a bomb run, when precision mattered most, became a guessing game through artificial fog. German night fighters even began homing on Mickey transmissions. The radar sets broadcast powerful signals that German receivers could detect from considerable distances. Pathfinder bombers became beacons, guiding fighters directly toward formations. Crews learned to minimize transmitter time, using radar in short bursts instead of continuous operation. That helped survival but degraded navigation accuracy. Despite these complications, radar pathfinding fundamentally changed the strategic bombing campaign over Europe. The statistics told the story clearly. In 1942, before radar pathfinding, the 8th Air Force averaged fewer than 6 bombing missions per month during winter weather. In the winter of 1943 to 44, with radar pathfinding operational, that number jumped to 22 missions per month. Weather no longer grounded the bombers. Bombing accuracy improved equally dramatically. In 1943, only about 13% of bombs dropped by radar-guided formations fell within 1,000 feet of the aim point. By mid-1944, that figure reached 35%, still far below the accuracy of visual bombing in clear conditions, which could put 60% within 1,000 feet. But 35% was enough to damage industrial targets significantly. The cumulative impact on German war production was substantial. Factories couldn't maintain output when bombs fell on them several times per month instead of once every few months. Even if individual raids didn't destroy facilities completely, repeated damage disrupted production, killed skilled workers, forced evacuation of machinery to less efficient locations. The steady pressure of continued bombing achieved what sporadic, highly accurate attacks couldn't. Oil became the critical target by mid-1944. Allied planners identified petroleum production as Germany's strategic weakness, destroy the oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants, and the Wehrmacht would grind to a halt for lack of gasoline. Tanks couldn't fight without fuel. Aircraft couldn't fly. Trucks couldn't transport supplies. Germany had. limited natural oil resources, and depended entirely on synthetic production from coal. Radar pathfinding made the oil campaign possible. The major synthetic fuel plants sat in the Ruhr Valley and central Germany, regions that experienced heavy cloud cover most of the year. Visual bombing could strike these targets only occasionally. Radar bombing could hit them continuously. Through summer and autumn 1944, American and British bombers hammered German oil production relentlessly. By December, output had fallen to 1/4 of 1943 levels. The Luftwaffe, which had contested Allied air superiority fiercely through early 1944, essentially ceased functioning by year's end. Not because Germany lacked aircraft or pilots, but because they had no fuel to fly training missions or combat sorties. German tanks and trucks sat immobilized. The Wehrmacht's mobility advantage that had dominated early war operations disappeared. Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments and War Production, later wrote that the oil campaign was the decisive blow against German industrial capacity, not the destruction of aircraft factories or tank plants or ball-bearing works. Those could be dispersed and rebuilt. Oil production required massive fixed installations that couldn't be moved or quickly replaced. Once destroyed, they stayed destroyed, and radar pathfinding ensured they could be hit regardless of weather. The technique that Hayes and other radar operators developed achieved strategic impact far beyond what any of them imagined on those winter missions over the North Sea. They were solving an immediate practical problem, figuring out how to hit targets they couldn't see. They didn't realize they were enabling a strategic bombing campaign that would cripple German military capacity and help end the war months earlier than otherwise possible. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, radar pathfinding had become so routine that it rarely merited special mention in mission reports. Every major bomber group had Mickey-equipped aircraft. Every mission into Germany included Pathfinders. The technology and techniques that seemed revolutionary 18 months earlier were now standard procedure. The forbidden method had become orthodox doctrine so thoroughly that people forgot it had ever been controversial. Hayes flew his final combat mission in August 1944 and returned to the United States in September. He'd completed 47 missions as a radar operator, more than double the 25-mission tour that was standard for bomber crews. His survival was partly luck, and partly the fact that Pathfinder crews were considered too valuable to risk unnecessarily. They flew on difficult missions when their expertise was essential. On easier missions, they stayed on the ground while less experienced crews gained experience. After the war, Hayes returned to civilian life and said little about his radar work. It remained classified for years. The specific techniques, the capabilities and limitations of the Mickey set, the entire Pathfinder program fell under secrecy restrictions that wouldn't be lifted until the 1950s. Even then, radar bombing received little attention in popular histories of the air war. The stories that captured public imagination were the dramatic daylight raids on Regensburg and Schweinfurt, the fighter battles over Berlin, the heroic tales of crews nursing damaged bombers home, the technical work of radar operators hunched over dim green scopes, calling heading corrections through the intercom, rarely made it into the narratives. It wasn't dramatic, it was methodical, detailed work that required more mathematics than heroics. But it was arguably more important to the campaign's success than many of the celebrated actions. The legacy of wartime radar pathfinding extended far beyond World War II. The techniques developed for bombing through Overcast became the foundation of post-war all-weather aviation. Airlines needed reliable navigation in poor visibility. Military aviation required the ability to operate regardless of weather. The lessons learned over Germany in 1944 shaped how those problems were solved for the next several decades. The H-2X radar technology itself evolved into peacetime applications. The radar sets removed from bombers after the war were modified for weather forecasting. The ability to see through clouds that made them useful for finding targets made them equally useful for detecting storms. The first weather radars in the late 1940s were literally converted H-2X sets from surplus B-17 seconds and B-29 seconds. The rotating scanner, the plan position display, the the signal processing techniques, all transferred directly from military to civilian use. Ground mapping radar developed even more sophisticated applications. The principle of using radar to create images of terrain below an aircraft led to synthetic aperture radar, side-looking airborne radar, and eventually the radar satellites that now map the Earth's surface in exquisite detail. Every one of those technologies traces its lineage back to the crude Mickey sets that gave fuzzy images of German cities through cloud cover. The concept of real-time navigation updates became fundamental to modern aviation. GPS provides what Hayes did manually with his radar scope, continuous position updates that allow course corrections throughout a flight. The difference is accuracy and automation. GPS gives positions accurate to meters instead of hundreds of meters. Computers calculate corrections automatically instead of requiring a human operator to measure and interpret. But the underlying concept, continuous navigation instead of periodic fixes, remains identical. The organizational lesson was equally important. The Army Air Forces learned that operational flexibility mattered more than rigid adherence to doctrine. When field operators discovered that unauthorized techniques worked better than official procedures, the smart response was to update the procedures, not punish the operators. That lesson shaped post-war military culture toward accepting innovation from below rather than just imposing it from above. The story of forbidden radar navigation techniques also illustrated the tension between specialization and integration. The Army Air Forces had created distinct crew positions with clear responsibilities to prevent confusion. Navigator navigates, bombardier bombs, radar operator operates radar. That specialization worked well until circumstances required overlap between specialties. The rigid boundaries that prevented confusion in normal operations became obstacles when circumstances demanded cooperation across specialty lines. The solution wasn't to eliminate specialization. The navigator and radar operator remained distinct positions with distinct training and responsibilities, but the boundaries between them became permeable. The radar operator could supplement navigation. The navigator could interpret radar returns. Both specialists worked together instead of in isolated lanes. That model of specialized positions with flexible collaboration became standard in complex military systems. The human dimension of the story deserves emphasis. Hayes and the other radar operators who developed continuous navigation techniques weren't following orders or implementing top-down directives. They were solving problems that command didn't fully understand yet. They took initiative despite official prohibitions because they could see that orthodox methods weren't working. That initiative came with risk. Violating procedures could mean court-martial, but they judged the operational necessity justified the personal risk. That calculation required confidence in their own expertise. Hayes knew his technique worked because he'd tested it on multiple missions. He'd compared radar-guided results against post-strike photography. He'd refined his methods based on what succeeded and what failed. By the time official doctrine caught up, he'd already developed systematic procedures that could be taught to others. His confidence came from demonstrated competence, not arrogance. The institutional response to that initiative mattered equally. Colonel Lawrence could have punished Hayes for violating procedures. That would have been entirely justified by regulations. Instead, Lawrence recognized effectiveness and asked to learn the technique. That openness to bottom-up innovation distinguished successful military organizations from ones that ossified into ineffectiveness. The rapid propagation of the technique through informal networks showed another important dynamic. Hayes taught his method to other radar operators in off-duty sessions. Those operators taught others. Within months, the technique spread throughout the 482nd and beyond. No official training program could have disseminated knowledge that quickly, but the informal network of practitioners sharing expertise with colleagues accomplished it effortlessly. This pattern of innovation, informal dissemination, eventual official adoption repeated throughout military history. Frontline troops discover tactical adaptations. Those adaptations spread through word of mouth faster than official channels could move. Eventually, command recognizes the value and formalizes the innovation into doctrine. The cycle continues because circumstances keep changing faster than formal procedures can adapt. The specific context of World War II made this cycle particularly visible. The technological evolution during the war was so rapid that formal training couldn't keep pace. New weapons, new tactics, new electronic systems appeared faster than manuals could be written. Operators had to improvise solutions based on incomplete information and learn from experience. The organizations that encouraged that improvisation and learned from it succeeded. Those that insisted on rigid adherence to outdated procedures failed. Radar pathfinding exemplified this dynamic perfectly. The Mickey set arrived in England barely tested, with minimal training materials, facing operational requirements that hadn't been fully anticipated. The official procedures written for the system were inadequate because nobody knew exactly how it would perform in combat. Only operational use revealed its capabilities and limitations. Only combat experience taught what worked and what didn't. The radar operators, who developed continuous navigation techniques, were conducting field experimentation without formal authorization. They tested hypotheses about how to use radar for navigation. They collected data from mission results. They refined their methods based on outcomes. They performed the scientific method under combat conditions. The fact that their experimental procedure violated regulations was almost incidental to the technical problem they were solving. This raises interesting questions about military innovation more broadly. How much experimentation should be allowed at operational level? When does initiative shade into insubordination? How can organizations balance the need for standardized procedures against the need for adaptation to changing circumstances? The radar pathfinding story doesn't provide definitive answers, but it illustrates the tensions clearly. The answer that emerged in practice was pragmatic. Allow initiative when it produces results. Punish violations that cause harm. Recognize that rules serve purposes, not the reverse. When rules prevent accomplishing the mission, change the rules rather than failing the mission. That pragmatism served the 8th Air Force well during the critical winter of 1943-44, when weather threatened to shut down the bombing campaign entirely. The cost of that success deserves acknowledgement. Radar pathfinding enabled more frequent bombing, which meant more missions, which meant more casualties. American bomber losses through 1944 were staggering. The 8th Air Force lost over 4,000 heavy bombers destroyed or damaged beyond repair, over 18,000 aircrew killed, another 25,000 captured or missing. The ability to bomb through Overcast meant those men faced danger more often. German civilian casualties also increased dramatically. Radar bombing was less accurate than visual bombing. The 35% of bombs falling within 1,000 feet of aim points meant 65% fell outside that radius. In dense urban areas, that translated to bombs hitting residential neighborhoods instead of factories. The distinction between strategic and area bombing blurred when accuracy limitations meant accepting significant collateral damage. The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945 illustrated this starkly. Poor weather forced pathfinders to use radar navigation. The railroad marshalling yards that were the nominal target appeared on radar as generic urban clutter, barely distinguishable from surrounding residential areas. The bombs scattered across the city center, igniting fires that killed tens of thousands of civilians. Radar pathfinding enabled the raid. Whether it should have been enabled remained controversial for decades afterward. These moral complexities don't diminish the technical achievement of the radar operators who developed continuous navigation techniques, but they remind us that technical solutions enable strategic choices, and strategic choices have consequences that extend beyond military effectiveness. The ability to bomb through clouds didn't determine whether such bombing was wise or necessary. It simply made it possible. The post-war career paths of the men involved in developing radar pathfinding varied widely. Some stayed in the newly independent Air Force and continued working with radar and electronic systems. Others returned to civilian life and applied their technical skills in emerging electronics industries. A few remained silent about their wartime work, unwilling to discuss experiences they found troubling in retrospect. Hayes himself worked briefly for RCA developing television systems in the late 1940s. The cathode ray tube displays he'd stared at over Germany translated easily to early television technology. But he left electronics work in the 1950s and became a high school physics teacher. He taught generations of students about radar and radio waves, without mentioning his wartime role in developing combat applications for those principles. Only in the 1980s, after most wartime radar systems had been declassified and historians began documenting the Pathfinder program in detail, did Hayes speak publicly about his experiences. By then, he was in his 60s, retired from teaching, watching his students' children attend the same schools. He gave a few interviews for historical projects, but remained uncomfortable with attention or praise. His perspective, expressed in a 1984 interview preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency archives, was characteristically modest. "We were just trying to hit what we aimed at. Sounds simple, but it wasn't. The radar helped some, not as much as we hoped, but enough. We did what worked and ignored what didn't. The brass eventually figured that out and made it official. That's all." That understated summary captured both the technical reality and Hayes's personality. The technique wasn't revolutionary. It was incremental improvement through practical experimentation. The institutional response wasn't dramatic. It was slow recognition of demonstrated effectiveness. The entire episode was ordinary people solving ordinary problems under extraordinary circumstances. Yet that ordinariness was precisely what made the story significant. Military effectiveness doesn't usually come from brilliant individual innovations or dramatic breakthrough moments. It comes from thousands of small improvements by competent professionals doing their jobs well. The radar operator taking one more fix than the manual required. The ground crew fixing equipment that should have been scrapped. The instructor adding an extra session because students weren't ready. Those accumulated incremental improvements determined outcomes more than the celebrated heroic actions. The forbidden technique that became official doctrine represented one such improvement, important but not decisive by itself. Combined with hundreds of other improvements in tactics, training, maintenance, logistics, and technology, it contributed to the strategic bombing campaign's eventual success. That success in turn contributed to Allied victory, though again as one factor among many rather than a decisive element. This contextual view matters for understanding military history accurately. Individual innovations and personal stories make compelling narratives. They help us connect emotionally with historical events, but they can distort our perception of how military effectiveness actually developed. The radar pathfinding story is worth telling not because Hayes or the technique were uniquely important, but because they exemplified patterns that repeated throughout the war and throughout military history. The pattern of operational necessity driving innovation, despite official resistance. The pattern of informal knowledge networks spreading techniques faster than formal channels. The pattern of institutional adaptation to demonstrated effectiveness. The pattern of technical capability enabling strategic choices. These patterns transcend specific technologies or conflicts. Understanding them helps make sense of how military organizations function under the pressure of war. The technology of radar bombing is obsolete. The H-2X Mickey set is a museum curiosity. The specific techniques for interpreting 3-centimeter radar returns have no modern application, but the organizational dynamics, the tension between standardization and innovation, the question of when to follow doctrine and when to improvise, remain as relevant as ever. Modern military organizations face the same fundamental challenge the 8th Air Force confronted in 1943: how to adapt rapidly to changing circumstances while maintaining enough standardization to coordinate complex operations. How to encourage initiative while preventing chaos. How to learn from experience without being paralyzed by bureaucracy. The answers developed then inform the approaches used now. The story of a forbidden technique that became orthodox doctrine serves as reminder that doctrine itself is simply codified experience. When circumstances change enough that experience becomes obsolete, doctrine must change too. The organizations that recognize this and adapt survive. Those that treat doctrine as immutable truth fail. Hayes and his fellow radar operators understood this intuitively. They changed their methods because circumstances required it. The institution eventually caught up because reality demanded it. That adaptive capacity, more than any specific weapon or tactic, determined which side prevailed in World War II. The Allies adapted faster and more effectively than the Axis. They developed new technologies and integrated them operationally more rapidly. They learned from defeats and modified approaches. They allowed initiative from below and incorporated successful innovations into doctrine. The accumulated effect of thousands of such adaptations overwhelmed opponents who couldn't match that flexibility. Radar pathfinding was one adaptation among many, important in its domain, but not uniquely decisive. Its significance lies in how clearly it illustrates the process of military innovation under pressure, an operational problem, a technical solution developed by practitioners, informal dissemination despite official prohibition, institutional resistance followed by reluctant acceptance, formal adoption and refinement, operational impact that justified the disruption of established procedures. That cycle repeated with radar countermeasures, with fighter tactics, with submarine warfare, with amphibious operations, with logistics systems. Every domain of military activity saw similar patterns of innovation and adaptation. The side that completed the cycle faster gained advantage. The side that resisted innovation or couldn't institutionalize successful experiments fell behind. The radar operators at Alconbury in the winter of 1943–44 weren't thinking about institutional dynamics or historical patterns. They were trying to hit targets through clouds. Their forbidden technique worked. The official doctrine didn't. They chose effectiveness over compliance. That choice, multiplied across thousands of similar decisions by thousands of other operators, mechanics, pilots, planners, and commanders, shaped the war's outcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.